principle is the rule of the fluids, and in simplicity, it means the fluids must flow. In order to heal, the fluids got to go somewhere. So I really like this quote, which I'll read. The blood and lymphatics flow freely. The tissue can perform their physiological functions without impedance. With the occurrence of trauma, this is both physical and emotional. The tissues contract, twist, and compress. And this is where the healing process gets all mixed up and the fluid flow becomes obstructed. So it's really important that the fluids are flowing. Next is structure governs function, or the function of a structure will also govern how the structure lives in space. So the shape of a joint, let's also think of organs, will define how it should move. And if it is unable to move properly, it will not function at its best. Each structure, so this is bone or organ, should live in its position with mobility and vitality in order to function. So let's take an example of the iliac bone. That needs to be on its axis with its neighbors so that it can move. It needs to be able to move in all its degrees of freedom, and it needs to be alive. Bones need to be alive in order for the healing process to occur. The third principle is the body as a unit. So this really ties into the fascia and how everything's connected, and also into the dimensions of healing, because this is the principle that your body and your mind and your spirit are all connected. And it's an integrated organ. We cannot heal one part at a time. We must think about the systems as a whole. And lastly is self-regulation. And I mentioned this before, how this is the most evident in nature. I think one of the things I think about as osteopath as a way of life, every time I see a critter outside, I go, there's no squirrel hospital. There are no animal hospitals. Yes, there's the vet, but the humans take them there. And so the nature in and animals, they're in this rhythm where they're thriving and finding resources to keep thriving. So us beings of nature, we also have this capacity to heal ourselves. And we can see this when we have a cut. Platelets will cover it up, we'll have a scab, and that will heal. If we have an injury, if a bone is broken, we can also heal that too. So, what happens when one or several of the principles or the mechanisms are not operating optimally? Now, this is what we're all trying to avoid. And the answer is dis-ease. Dis-ease is when the optimal physiology of our body is not experiencing ease. It's not easy to function in those ways. And how this presents in the pelvic brain is pelvic congestion. Some consequences of pelvic congestion are as such, and we can go into individual one of these and see how they relate to a mechanism or a principle. When it comes to fertility, we can think about this as the structures in the central axis because it has that hormonal component. And if we're thinking about hernias, we know that this is a weakness from pressures. And so that's relating to the pressure system. If you have too much pressure in your thorax or too much pressure in your abdomen, it can protrude the tissue out of that. And then we can see things like disc dysfunctions, lumbar disc dysfunctions, or SI joint. This is in the structural balance or the postural balance in the musculoskeletal structure, and even things like cysts or enlarged prostates. Now we're really more thinking towards the fluids, and why is there an accumulation of fluid in this specific site? Why aren't things be able to flow freely? We remember that principle. The fluids must flow. And then there are other consequences to this, because if we're in pain, it changes our behavior and our personality. So another consequence of pelvic congestion, thinking of the body as a unit, is that mind and spiritual component. We might be avoiding intimacy. We might be experiencing more anxiety and depression. And in a libido that's too high or too low, our pelvis might be overstimulated or understimulated. And why would congestion contribute to that? And overall, our pelvis, as our pleasure and joy center, as well as our decision making center, will be off balance. And that homeostasis in how we experience life on an emotional level will also be impacted. So this will be fun. We'll get into the anatomy of the pelvic brain. I'd like to keep it quite on the surface level, but if you want to dive into it together more, I would love that because anatomy is one of my favorite topics. The best way to learn anatomy is to feel it. So I'll invite you to palpate these bones together and I'll try to landmark it for you. So we're focusing on the pelvic container, and I'll just get a different view here so we can see a little bit more of my pelvis. And we'll also highlight the sacrum bone. So there's a hypothesis anatomy. If it looks similar, they behave similarly. So when we're looking at the sacrum and the cranial sacral unit, the sacrum connects up the vertebral column to the occiput. The occiput is in the back of the head, and you can palpate that here. And the sacrum will be the base of your spine, right above your sit bones. So you can palpate both of those structures. Really want you to get your hands on it and feel how they both have this slight curve to them and they're resting between two other bones. The sacrum is connected to the ilium just as the occiput is connected to the temporal bone. So just on the side of the ears here, we have two, right and left, and then same thing with the ilium, right and left. So to palpate your ilium, you'll find the top of your hip crest. It's the most bony part in your torso, and that will be the crest here. If you were to follow this behind you, it would dip down and eventually touch your sacrum. And if we were to start at the top again and come forward, we're finding the bony part of our hips, the most anterior part, and that would be the anterior aspect of the iliac. So the iliac, just like the temporal bones, they'll rotate, they can flare out and flare in, and they're in synchronicity with the sacrum and onto the other side. When we're thinking about the pubic symphysis, it's this cartilage between our pubic bone, and that is like our nose cartilage. So it's really interesting, I think. If you wanted to palpate your pubic symphysis, you would find the top of your lowermost pelvis in the front, almost where your zipper begins in your jeans, and it would be two little bony protuberances there and the cartilage in between there. And if you were to branch off from your nose, you would then find your zygoma, which is your cheekbones. And the same thing with the pubic symphysis and the pubic branch. If you went back down there where your zipper starts and you palpated, really get your hands on it. This is part of the pelvic brain. You need to be physically, manually connected to it. You can palpate the pubic branch and you can see visually it'll stop here, but continue into the ilium and you'll find the top of your hip here. One ligament that is common for hernias is the inguinal ligament, and that will be from the ilium to the pubic bone. So just orienting some ways you can have that diagonal palpation between both. And when it comes to the femur coming up into the hip bone like this is the femoral acetabulum or the hip joint, and that mirrors greatly the TMJ. How it's different in the cranium is that that mandible connects as one and is actually a hanging structure here. But when it comes to the femurs, we have the right and left femur, and these will behave similarly even in musculature because we can abduct or adduct the femur just like the jaw. We can move back and forth. We can flex and extend, and the jaw can swing forward and back as well. So there is a deep connection, which I'm sure you've heard before, especially in this community, between the pelvis and the TMJ. And when it comes to the ischium, so this is all the innominate bone, ilium, pubic, and ischium. These are known as our sit bones. And this is how we can perceive that postural balance and have if we're sitting evenly onto them. And that mirrors the occipital condyles. This is how we're holding our head up, and we can wobble and we can tilt. And just in our pelvis, we could be off axis and we could be living heavily on one ischium, and that is also consequently tilting our head. What is the consequence of this? All the fluids get pushed and dumped onto one side, affecting homeostasis. Here we go. We're making the chain here. And the coccyx. So we have the coccyx, which is just below the sacrum. But if we were to flip the occiput around and continue into the cranium, it would be the ethmoid. So the ethmoid is this bone behind our nose, behind our eyes in the depths, and it's continuation of the cranial base, just like the coccyx is a continuation of the sacral base. So I hope you're able to go and perceive where your coccyx is. It's right in between uh, your glute cheeks and all the other structures, especially the pubic symphysis. So what's really interesting about the pelvic container is that if you have pain on one side, it could mean that you need to move the opposite side more. So if your right hip is in pain, the container is telling you you need to move the left hip more. Same thing for the front. If you're experiencing low back pain, the body might be telling you you need to move the pubic bones more or the femurs more.